The sun beat down mercilessly on the bustling city streets, but Lucas Warburton barely noticed. At 45, his silver-streaked hair and perfectly tailored suit made him stand out among the hurried pedestrians. A self-made millionaire, Lucas had built his empire with an iron will, crushing competitors without a second thought. To the world, he was a man of power and wealth, untouchable, unshakable. As he walked briskly down the sidewalk, reaching for his phone to make an important call, he felt a sudden jolt. Someone had bumped into him. At first, he ignored it. Crowded streets meant occasional brushes with strangers. But then, instinct kicked in. His hand went to his pocket, and his expression darkened. His wallet was gone. Spinning on his heel, his sharp eyes locked onto a small figure slipping through the crowd. "Stop right there, you thief!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the afternoon air. Heads turned, and people stepped aside as they saw the imposing businessman charging forward. The thief, a frail, dirty-faced little girl no older than 10, darted through the sea of bodies with surprising speed. Her bare feet barely made a sound against the hot pavement as she weaved between fruit stands and newspaper racks. Lucas's polished Italian leather shoes pounded against the concrete as he chased after her. He wasn't just angry, he was furious. "A child?" he muttered under his breath, his hands balling into fists. A child had dared to steal from him? His pride took the insult harder than the crime itself. No one stole from Lucas Warburton and got away with it. Vendors scrambled to save their wares as the chase intensified. The girl knocked over a crate of oranges, sending them rolling in every direction. Lucas vaulted over the mess effortlessly, his athletic frame well-trained from years of boxing at an exclusive club. "You can't outrun me," he growled under his breath. The girl was fast, but Lucas was relentless. The streets grew narrower, the air thicker with the smell of garbage and exhaust. She took sharp turns into dimly lit alleys, trying to lose him, but each time she glanced over her shoulder, he was there, closer, stronger, determined. Finally, she made a mistake. At a dead-end alley, she skidded to a halt, chest heaving. Lucas slowed his pace, savoring his victory as he approached. "Nowhere left to run, little rat," he said, adjusting his cuffs. But as he stepped forward, something unexpected caught his eye, a worn-out shoebox filled with crumpled dollar bills and prescription bottles. And then, he saw it, the girl wasn't counting her stolen loot. She was clutching the money in desperation, whispering one word over and over. "Mama." Lucas Warburton had caught her. The little thief, no more than 10 years old, was cornered in the dim alleyway, her chest rising and falling in frantic gasps. Dirt streaked her face, her tattered clothes hanging loosely on her frail frame. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached, a victorious smirk tugging at his lips. "You thought you could steal from me?" Lucas scoffed, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "Do you even know who I am?" The girl clutched a handful of crumpled bills against her chest, her tiny fingers trembling. But instead of the defiance or guilt he expected, her wide, terrified eyes filled with tears. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. I just needed it for my mama. She's sick. She needs medicine." Lucas hesitated. His piercing gaze flickered to the ground, where his wallet lay open, bills scattered beside an old shoebox filled with loose change, empty prescription bottles, and handwritten notes. This wasn't a thief's hoard. This was survival. "Spare me the sob story," he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Stealing isn't the answer." Jenny, as she called herself, wiped at her face with a dirt-streaked sleeve. "I know," she choked out. "But the medicine costs $150 a bottle, and she needs 3 a month. I don't know what else to do." Lucas Warburton was a man of logic, of numbers. He had built his empire on calculated decisions, never letting emotions interfere with business. But this wasn't a negotiation, a merger, or a deal. This was a child, starving, desperate, and pleading for her mother's life. For reasons he couldn't understand, his grip on the situation loosened. The fire in his chest, his anger, his need for control, faltered. "Where is she?" he asked gruffly. Jenny's eyes widened in shock at his question, as if she couldn't believe someone like him would even care to ask. She hesitated, then whispered, "I'll show you." Lucas knew this was madness. He had meetings to attend, contracts waiting on his signature. But as he followed the limping child through the city's forgotten streets, past boarded-up shops and crumbling brick buildings, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, an unease, a responsibility he never asked for. And for the first time in years, Lucas Warburton didn't turn away. Lucas Warburton had never stepped into a place like this before. The tiny apartment smelled of damp air and sickness, the wallpaper peeling in long, jagged strips. The dim glow of a single flickering bulb barely illuminated the cramped room, where a frail woman lay motionless on a thin mattress on the floor. The place was cold, too cold for someone this sick. Jenny, the little thief who had stolen his wallet, rushed to the woman's side, her tiny hands trembling as she clutched a brown paper bag to her chest. "Mama, I got the medicine." Lucas stood in the doorway, still and silent, his sharp gaze scanning the scene before him. He had expected poverty, but not this. The woman, Jenny's mother, was far worse off than he had imagined. Her skin had a grayish hue, her breathing was uneven, and sweat clung to her forehead like beads of glass. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was life slipping away. Jenny turned toward him, her wide, pleading eyes filled with something Lucas hadn't seen in years, hope. You said you'd help," she stammered, her fingers tightening around the bag of medicine. "Please, Mr. Warburton. She doesn't have much time." Lucas Warburton didn't do charity. He had spent his entire life building an empire, crushing competition, and making deals that benefited only him. He had been raised to believe that if someone was struggling, it was their own fault, that the world didn't owe anyone kindness. And yet, something about this moment unsettled him. Maybe it was the way Jenny stood protectively over her mother, a child acting far older than her years. Maybe it was the desperate way the woman's body trembled with every ragged breath. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the way Jenny had risked everything for one bottle of medicine. Without a word, Lucas pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he dialed a private number, one he rarely used. "I need a doctor," he said briskly. "Now." Jenny's breath hitched. "You mean it?" Lucas exhaled slowly. What the hell was he doing? "Yes, kid," he muttered, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "I mean it." Jenny let out a shaky sob, clutching her mother's hand. Lucas looked away, uncomfortable. Emotions weren't his thing. Within minutes, his call was answered. A private physician, one of the best in the city, was on his way. Lucas paced the small apartment while they waited, his polished shoes clicking against the warped wooden floorboards. He barely fit inside the cramped space, his presence too large, too out of place in a world he had never known. Jenny knelt beside her mother, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "Mama, just hold on. Help is coming." For the first time in years, Lucas Warburton felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not regret. Not guilt. Responsibility. and it terrified him. The wait felt endless. Lucas Warburton, a man used to controlling every situation, now found himself pacing the small, dimly lit apartment, checking his watch every few seconds. The room was unbearably cold, and a sharp scent of sickness clung to the air. On the mattress, Samantha, Jenny's mother, barely moved. Her chest rose and fell in uneven, shallow breaths, her face pale and damp with fever. Every few moments, a weak cough rattled through her frail body. Jenny never left her side. She sat cross-legged on the floor, clutching her mother's limp hand between her small fingers. "Hold on, Mama," she whispered, brushing a damp strand of hair from her mother's forehead. "Help is coming." Lucas didn't know why, but the sight of the girl's unwavering devotion made something twist deep inside him. A feeling he had long buried. A sharp knock at the door broke the heavy silence. Lucas crossed the room in 2 quick strides and pulled it open. Dr. Emerson, an older man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a weathered face, stepped inside. He carried a worn leather medical bag, the kind that spoke of decades of experience. "You're late," Lucas snapped, his usual impatience creeping in. Dr. Emerson raised a brow but ignored him. He turned his attention to Samantha, his trained eyes quickly assessing her condition. With practiced efficiency, he knelt beside the mattress and pulled out his stethoscope. Jenny held her breath, watching his every move. The doctor listened to Samantha's breathing, his expression unreadable. He checked her pulse, lifted her eyelids, and gently pressed on her stomach. "How long has she been like this?" Dr. Emerson finally asked, his voice calm but firm. "A few days," Jenny answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It got worse last night." Dr. Emerson exhaled, shaking his head. "She's severely dehydrated, and her fever is dangerously high. Her lungs sound weak, it could be pneumonia." He glanced at Lucas. "We need to get her to a hospital." Jenny's face crumpled. "No. They won't take us. We don't have insurance. They turned us away before." Lucas stiffened. Of course. The system. The very same system that had never failed him was built to fail people like Jenny and her mother. "Then she won't go to just any hospital," Lucas said, his voice decisive. He pulled out his phone and dialed another number. "I want an ambulance here immediately. Private transport. She'll be admitted to St. Vincent's under my account." Jenny's eyes widened. "But..." "No buts, kid," Lucas interrupted, shoving his phone back into his pocket. "She's not dying in this place." Tears welled in Jenny's eyes, but this time, they weren't just from fear, they were from hope. Dr. Emerson gave Lucas a long, measuring look, then nodded approvingly. "Good call." He reached into his bag, pulling out an 4 drip. "We need to stabilize her until the ambulance arrives." Lucas watched as the doctor worked quickly, inserting a needle into Samantha's frail arm. Jenny held her mother's hand tightly, whispering reassurances even as silent tears slipped down her cheeks. Outside, the faint sound of sirens grew louder. For the first time in years, Lucas Warburton felt something he couldn't quite explain. He had all the power in the world. But tonight, he was using it for something that actually mattered. The ambulance tore through the city streets, sirens wailing in the night. Lucas Warburton sat stiffly in the back, his sharp eyes fixed on Samantha's still form. The dim glow of the overhead lights made her pale skin look almost ghostly, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Jenny sat beside her mother, clutching her limp hand with both of her own, her small fingers trembling. "Mama, we're almost there," she whispered, her voice raw from hours of crying. You're going to be okay." Dr. Emerson hovered over Samantha, checking the fort and monitoring her pulse. His expression was tight with concern. "She's barely holding on," he muttered, adjusting the oxygen mask over her face. "Her body is weak. The pneumonia is advancing faster than I'd like." He turned to Lucas. "We need her admitted immediately." Lucas nodded sharply. He had already pulled every string necessary to bypass any bureaucratic delays. When they arrived at St. Vincent's private hospital, doctors and nurses were already waiting at the emergency entrance. The moment the ambulance doors swung open, a team rushed forward, lifting Samantha onto a gurney with expert precision. "We need her on high-flow oxygen," a nurse instructed. "Let's move." Jenny tried to follow, but as the gurney disappeared through the hospital doors, a security guard stepped forward, blocking her way. "Only immediate family past this point," he said firmly. Tears welled in Jenny's wide, exhausted eyes. "I am her family," she pleaded, panic rising in her voice. "She needs me." Before Lucas even had time to think, his instincts took over. "She's with me," he barked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. "She goes in." The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking between Lucas's expensive suit and Jenny's ragged clothes. Then, without another word, he stepped aside. Jenny rushed forward, clutching Lucas's sleeve for just a moment before hurrying after her mother. Lucas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. What was he doing? How had he ended up here? An unforgiving reality. Hours passed in a blur of sterile white halls, hushed voices, and the rhythmic beeping of machines. Lucas had spent countless nights in boardrooms, fighting to seal billion-dollar deals, but this was different. This was a fight for someone's life. He sat in the waiting area, legs stretched out, arms crossed, his usual confidence replaced with something foreign, unease. Across from him, Jenny sat curled up in a stiff plastic chair, her tiny frame swallowed by an oversized hospital blanket. She hadn't spoken in over an hour. She just stared at the double doors that led to the ICU, waiting for news. Lucas wasn't sure what made him say it, but after a long silence, he muttered, "Your mom is strong, kid. She's fighting." Jenny turned to him, her dark eyes filled with something unreadable. For the first time, she didn't look at him with fear, but with trust. "She has to be," she whispered. "Because I don't have anyone else." Lucas swallowed hard. Neither did he. At that moment, the doors swung open. A doctor approached, looking serious but not grim. Lucas and Jenny stood as one. "How is she?" Jenny's voice was barely above a whisper. The doctor sighed, flipping through his notes. "She's stable for now, but the next few hours are critical." He looked at Jenny. "We're doing everything we can." Lucas placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "We wait," he said, his voice softer than he ever thought possible. And so they did. Together. The quiet hum of machines filled the ICU, punctuated by the steady beeping of heart monitors. Lucas Warburton stood outside the glass window, arms crossed, his normally confident posture rigid with tension. On the other side of the glass, Samantha lay motionless, an oxygen mask covering her face, IVs snaking from her arms. Beside him, Jenny pressed her small hands against the window, her breath fogging up the glass. Her face, streaked with dry tears, was pale from exhaustion, but she refused to leave. "Why isn't she waking up?" Jenny's voice was barely above a whisper. Lucas didn't have an answer. Dr. Emerson approached, flipping through Samantha's chart. He glanced at Jenny, then at Lucas. His expression was careful, measured. "She made it through the night," he said. "That's a good sign." Jenny turned to him, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "Then she's going to be okay?" The doctor hesitated. "She's stable, but she's not out of danger. The pneumonia was severe, and her body is weak. We'll need to monitor her closely." Lucas watched as Jenny's small shoulders sagged. She had been holding on so tightly to the idea that her mother would just wake up and everything would be okay. "What can we do?" Lucas asked, his voice quieter than usual. Dr. Emerson sighed. "Right now, we wait. And we hope." Lucas hated waiting. In business, he was a man of action. He fixed things, made things happen. But now, all he could do was stand in the sterile hallway of a hospital and hope that a woman he barely knew, but who had somehow come to matter, would survive. Unspoken fears. Jenny refused to leave her mother's bedside. Even when a nurse brought her a cup of warm soup, she just sat in the stiff hospital chair, staring at Samantha's unmoving form. Lucas sat across from her, his sharp eyes watching the child with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something uncomfortably close to concern. "You need to eat," he finally said. Jenny shook her head. "I'm not hungry." Lucas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. What was he supposed to do? He had never taken care of anyone but himself. After a long pause, he stood, walked over, and crouched down beside her chair. "Your mom wouldn't want you to make yourself sick waiting for her." Jenny finally turned to look at him. "What if she never wakes up?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words hit Lucas harder than he expected. For a moment, he saw himself, a young boy, standing in a hospital just like this one, watching his own mother slip away. His throat tightened. "She will," he said firmly, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was telling the truth. A moment of change. The hours blurred together. Nurses came and went, machines beeped, and Lucas found himself pacing the length of the waiting room, his patience wearing thin. Then, in the early hours of the morning, something changed. A nurse rushed past them, heading straight for Samantha's room. Jenny bolted up from her chair, fear flashing in her wide eyes. "What's happening?" she cried. Lucas grabbed her hand before she could run into the room. The nurse turned, her face not panicked, but urgent. "She's waking up." Jenny let out a strangled sob, her small fingers tightening around Lucas's hand. Lucas exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. For the first time in days, he felt something close to relief. Samantha was fighting. And against all odds, she was winning. The steady beeping of heart monitors filled the hospital room as Samantha's eyelids fluttered open for the first time in days. The dim light cast a soft glow over her pale face, her body weak but alive. At her bedside, Jenny gasped, her small hands gripping her mother's limp fingers. "Mama." Lucas Warburton, standing by the doorway, let out a slow breath. He had spent years making split-second decisions, closing multi-million-dollar deals without hesitation. Yet, standing here now, watching this fragile moment between mother and daughter, he felt something shift deep inside him. Samantha's gaze, though tired and unfocused, locked onto Jenny's tear-streaked face. A faint, weak smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Sweet pea, you're here." Tears spilled freely down Jenny's face. "Of course, I'm here. I never left." Her small body shook with emotion. "You scared me, Mama. I thought I lost you." Lucas turned away, giving them a moment. Something about the rawness of their love made his chest tighten. Dr. Emerson entered the room, his expression carefully neutral as he checked Samantha's vitals. The relief in Jenny's face was short-lived as she watched the doctor's serious demeanor. "Your fever's gone down, and your oxygen levels are improving," he said, offering a small nod of approval. "But, Samantha, we need to talk about your condition." Jenny immediately stiffened. "She's okay now, right?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Dr. Emerson hesitated. "She's stable," he clarified, "but she's not out of danger." His voice softened. "Samantha, your body has been through a lot. Your lungs took a serious hit, and there's something else." Lucas saw it before the words even left the doctor's mouth. Samantha's expression shifted, fear, realization, and then devastation. She tried to move her legs beneath the blanket. Nothing. Her breathing hitched. She tried again, harder this time, her fingers gripping the sheets as she willed her body to respond. Still nothing. A strangled sob escaped her lips. "No, no, no, no." Jenny looked between her mother and the doctor, her own fear rising. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Why won't she move?" Dr. Emerson placed a gentle hand on Samantha's shoulder. "Your body was under extreme stress for too long. The lack of oxygen caused nerve damage." He hesitated. "Right now, it seems like you've lost movement in your legs." Samantha's chest rose and fell in short, panicked breaths. "You mean I'm—" "We don't know if it's permanent," the doctor interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "But we'll need extensive therapy to see if we can regain mobility." Lucas watched as Samantha's world crumbled in front of him. She covered her face with shaking hands, her shoulders racked with silent sobs. Jenny immediately climbed onto the bed, wrapping her tiny arms around her mother. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered fiercely. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Lucas expected Samantha to reassure her daughter, to say something hopeful. But when she finally lifted her tear-streaked face, she didn't look at Jenny. She looked at him. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice shaking. Lucas Warburton, a man who had never concerned himself with anyone else's future, realized in that moment that he had a choice to make. And this time, walking away wasn't an option. The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Samantha sat motionless in her hospital bed, her hands trembling as they rested on the blanket covering her unmoving legs. The weight of the doctor's words still hung heavy in the air. Paralyzed. She had spent her life fighting, pushing forward no matter the struggle. But this was something she never could have prepared for. Jenny, ever resilient, clutched her mother's hand tightly, as if sheer willpower could force Samantha's legs to move again. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered. "You're alive. That's what matters." Samantha blinked rapidly, trying to stop the tears threatening to spill. She had to be strong for Jenny. She always had to be strong. But what if she couldn't be? Lucas Warburton stood near the window, staring out at the bright city skyline. He had seen people break before. He had crushed men in boardrooms, watched businesses collapse under his decisions. Yet, nothing had ever unsettled him like watching this woman, this mother, fight to hold herself together in front of her daughter. It reminded him of someone. His own mother. A memory surfaced, uninvited, her tired face, the way she had hidden her pain from him, always telling him everything would be fine, even when it wasn't. Lucas inhaled sharply, pushing the thought aside. This wasn't his battle. And yet, he was still here. He turned back toward the bed. "You need the best rehabilitation care," he said flatly, his voice all business. "I can make that happen." Samantha looked up sharply, her exhausted eyes narrowing. Why? Lucas didn't flinch. He never did. But something about the way she asked it, like she didn't trust kindness, like she didn't believe in miracles, made his stomach tighten. Because I can, he said simply. Samantha studied him, her expression unreadable. And what do you expect in return? Lucas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't sure how to answer that. He had spent his entire life making transactions, favors, deals, partnerships. But this wasn't business. Finally, he met her gaze. Nothing, he admitted. I just don't want to walk away. Samantha's breath hitched. She wasn't used to people staying. Jenny, still holding her mother's hand, looked between them. Then, she turned to Lucas, her small voice filled with something rare, hope. Does that mean we're not alone anymore? Lucas Warburton, a man who had built his entire life around the idea that attachments were weaknesses, felt something shift inside him. He didn't have an answer. But for the first time in years, he wanted to find one. Yeah, kid, he murmured. You're not alone. Life has a way of bringing unexpected encounters that can change us forever. Lucas Warburton, a man who once measured success in wealth and power, found something far more valuable, human connection. His journey with Jenny and Samantha reminds us that compassion is not a weakness, but a strength, one that can transform not only the lives of others but also our own. For many of us, especially in later years, it's easy to believe that our roles in life are set, that change is for the young. But Lucas's story proves that it is never too late to rewrite our own narrative. One act of kindness, one decision to stay instead of walking away, can ripple through the lives of those around us. Perhaps the greatest lesson is that family is not always about blood, but about those who stand by us when we need them most. No matter where we are in life, we have the power to make a difference, to be the person who reaches out, who listens, who chooses to stay. Because in the end, the true measure of a life well lived is not what we gain, but what we give.